All right. Welcome to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect, everyone. My name is Jared Mello, and today I have back again my friend Christian. How are you today, Christian?
Doing well, Jared. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure having you on. And today, what I wanted to do is start at the home
Mhm.
and then try to move outward from there. And we were,
Concentric circles of
yeah,
expansion.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
And so you were talking to me, as we always talk, a long time before we even press record
yeah,
here.
yeah,
But
yeah.
But you're talking about your narcissistic father. And I
Mhm.
wanted to figure out or learn more about what that was like for you in particular growing up.
Yeah. Well, my father's always been very confusing for me. He was a follower of this man named Swami Rama, who, in people in meditation circles, may understand who he is, who is also a complicated man and turned out to be, an abuser. But so my dad was a yoga and meditation teacher since like the late 60s, early 70s. And so he always, I kind of call him a hype beast. Like he was a he was a skateboarder in Long Island and surfing off Montauk. He always seems to be into some shit. But like he was very confusing as a kid because I'm not sure if he's a narcissist, a sociopath, a psychopath. Like he has heavy narcissistic qualities, but he doesn't need people quite in the way that the traditional narcissist does. But it was very like confusing. My parents got divorced when I was 7, and he basically just stopped talking to my mother. Right? She breached the topic of co-parenting, and I believe she told me, he said, "You'll do it your way, and I'll do it my way, and we don't need to talk about it." And so, I ended up being split into two, basically. That there was this dad who's this yoga meditation guy. He was a co-owner of a large new age record label, so it's like the record executive yoga spaces. These are crawling with narcissists. And then my mother sent me to Catholic school, right? And when she remarried a banker, so it went from being this like yoga kid to like, why aren't you a banker's kid? you know and so with my dad, it's he's not really malignant unless you back him into a corner. The And I think a lot of the distance between us was, I always kind of, I didn't I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, so there wasn't, in like 1984, walking into Catholic school and being a vegetarian in Port Washington, Wisconsin. There was nobody really like that, right? Like he was not like any other dads that I knew. And so, looking back, there's no real emotional connection. But he was this titanic figure. I always kind of joke that like most of who I am is his mask. Like I didn't know it turned out like the yoga meditation stuff, like he never taught his children to meditate or taught them yoga. And so to me, that's informative, where the narcissist always wants to appear to be the thing, but they don't really care about actually being the thing. So for my father, there was no value sitting in a room with his two kids teaching these things that he's supposedly, dedicating his life to. The value was in being perceived
Mm.
doing those things, right? And so he kind of kept all of his interests from us, right? He didn't teach me to windsurf. He built me a skateboard ramp once when I was 8. I literally never went off it. And it was just him kind of cosplaying. I call narcissists as parents, I call them Potemkin parents, right? Like a Potemkin village. You go to North Korea or increasingly other places that will remain unmentioned. And, like they're showing the journalists all these storefronts and they're filled with fruit and whatever, whatever. And you open the door and there's absolutely nothing behind them. To me, that's the narcissistic parent, that like their delusions of grandeur, their need to be kind of perceived a certain way, means that they can be performative in their parenting. It can look like they're actually very active parents. My dad, it never looked that way. I should point this out. But there's nothing behind the surface, And
Mm.
so I think it was really hard. I mean, when my dad left, he destroyed my mother. Like I mean, my mother came from a Catholic family of 9. I don't think divorce was in her vocabulary. And so when things went bad, they went really, really bad. I was 7, which I'm told is probably about the worst age to kind of go through something like that, based on like where we're at, like
Yeah.
personality wise. And so the fact that he kind of destroyed my mother really, I mean, when I look back on my kind of mental health, it's all rooted in abandonment traumas and other kind of traumas. I mean, when they got divorced, um, he would do things like go to Florida to see his mother. We're all supposed to hang out, and he would just dump me with his mother, who I didn't know, and disappear for a week, which totally, and I'd have like a week-long meltdown, because
Mm.
it's replicating this abandonment trauma. So I don't know, a long way to say it's really confusing. I think, I struggle now, like I haven't spoken or seen him in a couple years. He actually has, this is kind of embarrassing, but I was going through shadow work and recovery and coming into the awareness of how emotionally regulated I'd been. And my father would say openly for decades, come back to me when you're not angry. And so I was going through a period of learning to express my anger, and I made the mistake of putting them into text messages and emails. And as I'm doing this, some guy called me from New York and said, "Hey, I'm your brother. Your dad's my dad." And I fucking lost it. Like
Mm.
I started, like, the anger got the best of me, and so he took me for a restraining order, and that's still on. But it was like crazy town, like
Sure.
he this is how narcissists confabulate and lie, right? Like this is why they're so horrible in court. The first thing he said was, "I thought the relationship was fine until I wouldn't take him to Hawaii 4 years ago." Now you can see the narcissist working there, like, oh, this is just a spoiled brat. I wouldn't take him to Hawaii, so he's doing all of this. But the real story is my dad started going to Hawaii on Christmas in the late 90s for a couple weeks and went every year, meaning I hadn't spent a Christmas with my father since the late 90s. And this was like 2020. Narcissists, as they do, hate being parents, but for some reason, a lot of times they want to be grandparents. We can get into why that is if you want. But so he started taking my sister and her family, right? And not me. So 7 out of the 8 family members going to Hawaii for Christmas. And I had a meltdown, right? And he made it about Hawaii. It was about me wanting to spend Christmas with my father and my nieces and my nephews. But you can't really go into that in court. And so the court scene was a nightmare. Like, he's up there just lying, sharing pictures of me in mental health crisis. I took my stress ball out to manage the stress, and the bailiff comes over and rips it out of my hand and claims I might throw it at my dad. So he's being protected from a Nerf ball while he's ripping open my deepest traumas and lying about me on a witness stand. And so that's pretty intense, but that kind of sums up him. His
Well,
wife.
how would he present to the world as a
He's
spiritual
he's
narcissist?
very he's very quiet. He's very private. I think he presents as this aloof guru wannabe, that like he still is devoted to the Swami, despite the fact that Swami had to leave the country when he was convicted of sex crimes. That organization is on cult watch. And so his inability to kind of process and deal with that was another part of the restraining order, was that, like, one of the people in the organization died, and I said I was going to go to the funeral at the yoga society where they are, and so that was a no for me to show up there. But he's incredibly soft spoken, but again, he's a record executive, so he was negotiating, in the music business, which is drowning in narcissism. But I actually think narcissists are preternatural negotiators because of the way supply works, that they just know what's good for them and what's not. And so
Mm.
when it's not good for them, he just gets up, says fuck you, and leaves the table. But I think this is a really long-winded answer. It was all just really confusing,
Mm.
like, to this day, this is going to sound weird, I miss him, like I have this. He was such a titanic figure, that this yoga meditation stuff created such a different experience. He owned a bookstore, like a yoga Eastern bookstore, when I was very little. So I literally learned to walk amidst all these kind of Buddhist, Taoist, all these different kind of spiritual traditions. And I'm really actually grateful for that, like, in a weird way, I became his mask. And he would whatever he was reading, I would read. Whatever, like the record label stuff was great because it was like he could get concert tickets to anything. He would get so much when he sold his company to Virgin Records. I got an EMI catalog that was this thick. And I got to circle whatever. This is also a great triangulation. I got to circle everything I wanted. I literally got something like 5,000 CDs. My sister came home from college and saw all of them. She didn't get any. Right. And so this is kind of him, like how he played us off against. We'd go every Saturday, we'd go to movies. I love movies. He was just lazy, but my sister would always complain that we'd see the movies I wanted to see. And he allowed that to go. But the reality was we would see the movies he wanted to see. We're both dudes. We didn't want to go see, whatever my sister wanted. And it, I have a really, to this day, like I've been dealing with a lot of shame and guilt for missing him, for kind of minimizing the damage. But I think it's just natural that it's like whenever I feel that, I actually kind of pat myself on the back and I say, well, that's a sign you didn't become him. Like he's your father. Of course, there are elements that you miss. Of course, you miss even if it wasn't. I always describe narcissistic parents as a light socket with no energy, right? And so the kid keeps plugging their lamp in, trying to get a connection, but it just never happens. But we become connected to them. They just don't have the ability to kind of connect to us. And so I don't know what will happen, with him and I, but part of me thinks I've seen him for the last time, and that's really actually kind of sad to me, but
yeah, it could be. I mean, time will tell, as they say.
Well, I kind of look at it like his relationship with his son is actually, I didn't get to set the terms of the relationship, he did. And so, I mean.
And that must have been a lot, though, too, having on one hand going to Catholic school, and then on the other hand having this spiritual meditation guru dad. How do you?
I consider that spiritual abuse. I think of me as a little kid, third grade, sitting in religion class in Catholic school, having this entirely different spiritual template that I was introduced to first. And not you think in religion class I could start talking about yoga, and bringing like the no. And so it created this there's a scene in The Departed where Leo is talking to his therapist about something like this, where his mother, there were different like class dynamics in his mother and father in Boston, and how it's like code shifting, where we're like raised in two different worlds. And so a lot of my healing process has been to integrate those two things, right? I mean, my mother literally forced me to become confirmed, so I'm a confirmed Catholic technically, but also had a Swami. And also, I mean, I studied a lot of comparative religion stuff in college. It's always been an interest of mine. And I honestly think some of the reason the people that listen to me like me is that there is this influence of East and West, and that a lot of Eastern religion and a lot of Eastern traditions are actually rooted in mental health care, right? That like the Christians invented this kind of narcissist up in the sky to worship, and that they called that religion, whereas a lot of Eastern traditions, and I don't mean to like, a lot of Eastern traditions like Buddhism, for instance, are about our monkey mind. Now there's obviously dogma and kind of mythology around them as well, but like, like thinking about, is praying meditating? Is that a form of meditation? Like trying to find like, I think so. I think it is. Trying to find out, I was telling you beforehand, like the Swami's, one of his disciples gave a speech to the UN called Unifying Streams of Religion. And so I think my mind had to make sense of these things. There was a lot of shame in Catholic school for having this Swami, for having divorced parents, and working through that strange, I mean, I grew up in a very kind of, we moved when I was, I think, in fifth grade. And so we moved to this kind of very conservative suburb of Milwaukee, and going to Catholic school. And it was just a very different vibe. And I think our minds as young children work better with consistency of these types of things. I mean, it's almost like being raised in two different cultures, but completely separately, because my parents didn't talk. And like my mother was so angry with my father that I see her second choice as like the complete opposite of my father, right? And that was very confusing. But like I wasn't allowed to eat meat till I was like in like first grade. Eventually, I was like, why can't I have hot dogs? And so that ended. And then by like 13, they were forcing like steak and meat on me because I was supposed to play Division I college basketball, and a lot of that is about not just skill but like strength. And so there was all these kind of shifts in what was expected that were very confusing.
Right. And were you the scapegoat and then your sister was the golden child, or did that depend on where you were?
Ultimately, that's how it figured out. My dad and my sister always had a very different relationship. They were always much closer. I kind of have this theory, and it's not always, but like narcissistic parents, like the dads always kind of gravitate towards the daughters, and the mothers. Again, this is not always, but I think a lot of times narcissistic dads see their sons as rivals, and they don't really see their daughters that way. And so my sister had a very different experience. My sister is a very different person. She's, and it was also different. Like when I was a basketball star, I was probably the golden child, at least with my mother. But then when I quit, like everybody hated me.
Hmm.
This is a sad story, but it's like my house burned down um, sophomore to junior summer, right? And so my dad had just built this massive house like 5 minutes from my mom's house, but being a narcissist didn't invite us to live with him. So I ended up living in like a residence inn as a 16-year-old by myself for a summer, and then in a condo. And I got in trouble, shockingly, as a 16-year-old with my own apartment, and everything kind of unraveled. And then I became the scapegoat. Like I was the identified patient. I was sent to therapy always by myself. There's never been a time where uh, I think this is kind of indicative of what it's like to grow up with narcissistic parents, is that there was never any acknowledgement. I always say the dysfunction that arises from that family dynamics is always characterized as disobedience. And so there was never any acknowledgement that like I was fucked up by the divorce, by their inability. I don't have a single memory of my parents having a conversation that's not just dripping with contempt, and like they would only talk about money, and then it was always just arguing. My mom would say my dad didn't give us enough money, he doesn't love us. My dad would say that's why I give your mom money, go ask her. And so this kid is just looking up going like, bro, I just need a fucking sweater. Like and so there's so much. It's like the kid doesn't really exist to the narcissistic parent, right? They exist like as an idea, right? The idea of the child will be parented and kind of manipulated to create the forward facing, whatever the narcissist wants to be perceived as. The kid has to either fall in line or get scapegoated. And so this identified patient thing really hurt me, because it told me that I was the problem, that like I had a lot of anger issues. And where's this anger coming from? Well, when looking back, it's all pretty obvious. I mean, a child at 7 going through an emotionally violent divorce, having parents that didn't make any space for my emotional response to any of this. So of course there were all these emotions coming out sideways. Once I discovered pot, it was like, okay, now I'm just smoking pot all the time,
Yeah.
and that was a very easy thing to scapegoat. But I didn't know why I gravitated toward. I didn't. It wasn't like I was intentionally doing these things, right? It's like this kid trying to be who they wanted me to be, but who they wanted me to be kept changing. My mom wanted something different than my dad, and then you go to college and it's basically you're out in the world. And I don't think I was really prepared.
Hmm. It's kind of like a two-face origin there, right? Where on one hand you want to be like your dad, and then
Yeah.
on another hand you're trying to like please your mom as well. So you have like a split
Right, right, right,
personality
right. It,
almost.
it, it, it was very much like that. And then you develop the habit of doing that in friend groups, right? Of this kind of like people pleasing, essentially, where instead of having this singular sense of self, that goes out and exists in all dynamic situations, the habit becomes to, well, when I go with my dad, I bend to him. When I'm home with my mom, I bend to her. And also, I have a complicated relationship with my mother, but I think this dynamic with narcissist dads happens a lot where the mother ends up taking a lot of the emotional brunt of it because the child is so repressed in the relationship with the father that the safe parent will end up being an emotional dumping ground. And
Mm.
I mean, I look back and part of my healing is personal responsibility and say like, yeah, there have been times where I've been abusive. This restraining order thing, I felt righteous and I had to like express all this anger, but it was vicious, right? And like part of my own contract I have with myself is to acknowledge that, like, regardless of all the water under the bridge, regardless of the fact that I know I had to express that anger, I also have to own that it was a really ugly situation, and that I went probably harder than I should. I mean, the secret brother thing though, just really, I mean,
Yeah.
to this day, nobody's spoken to me about it. My dad won't speak about it. My sister won't speak to me about it. So I mean, I don't. I look at the guy. It looks like my dad, but nobody's had a simple conversation. My dad just said, "Oh, all that guy wants is money," which is ironically what he says about me. Um, which is odd that they said it in the restraining order complaint, which was written by my stepmother, and he signed it. My stepmother, no. And it said all Chris wants is money, which is what she wants. But I would said to the judge, like, if all I wanted was money, why would I be doing any of this? Like,
Right.
wow, like, not, that doesn't make any sense. What I wanted was a dad, and all he, the narcissistic parent a lot of times will substitute money for parenting too, where it's like there's no time, there's no anything. I'll just throw money at you, right? And so it creates this dependency in the child, but it's a little bit more insidious than that when you're not getting anything emotionally from the parent, the narcissistic parent. And so the money becomes a substitute for love, where it's literally the only time you feel cared for.
Mm.
And it creates this really dysfunctional relationship to money. It creates kind of like this learned helplessness and dependency where, like, if he's not helping me, he doesn't love me. I mean, it goes back to my mother also saying, your dad doesn't love us. He doesn't give us any money. You can see the way that these dysfunctional interpersonal dynamics shape the dysfunction in the child, right? They're shaping unhealthy relationships, not just to people, but to energies. Like, I think of
Sure.
money as like an energy, basically. And
And
I've
people
had
do
this.
say that. They say that the way people see money is often how they see love as well. And they can kind of
Yeah,
be
yeah.
intertwined.
Yeah, well, and I mean, my dad did throw a lot of money at me, but it was like throwing money at a kid with a drug problem his whole life. Like, what I needed was presence in my life, right? What I
Right.
needed was somebody to be in my emotional life, caring for me. And from the outside looking in, you'd say, "Oh, this kid's spoiled," but like, I didn't have, neither of my parents really were ever in the reality of my life. I think that's another big characteristic of narcissistic parents, but narcissists in any relationship, is that they're defining the entire reality of the relationship. And so they're always reflecting this inverted or distorted reality back to whether it's their child, their partner, whoever. And so, I call it life dysmorphia, that we emerge with this very dysmorphic understanding of ourselves, understanding of our family, and that a lot of, they would call it shadow work or whatever, is actually reality testing what actually happened. And I mean, this is where the scapegoat trauma gets a little weird, because a lot of times the healing is taking responsibility, but to take responsibility is to actually say, it wasn't my fault as a child.
Hmm.
It was not none of this, like, it was all above my psychological capabilities. And it almost killed me. I mean, honestly, like, we were talking, I had to, I mean, when I started, I think it was like 2017 where I checked myself into rehab and began all this stuff. um, Part of the healing was saying at some point it did become my responsibility, but as a small child in these formative years and as a teenager, there just wasn't anybody in the reality of my life. My neurodiversity, trauma became a big part of my understanding of my life, CPTSD, but no therapist ever said that till I was like 39,
Mm. And that's something to get into too in a little bit here, the autistic slash neurodivergent piece. But
yeah.
one thing we didn't talk about last time is you and romantic relationships with maybe narcissistic people. Did you find yourself gravitating to them?
I found myself in relationships with narcissists. Yep. And like I was saying, I think of it like your parents set your templates for relationships, right? And so I like to say it like this: like a normal relationship, person A here, person B here, and they move into a shared space, and that shared space is called a relationship. A narcissist never really moves, and so it's not a shared space. It's the tyranny of their perspective. And
Mm,
so when that's your parent, it conditions you to see relationships through the lens of surrender, basically, of becoming that person or moving into their reality. And so I think when we go out into the world, we on an unconscious level, we recognize those dynamics as familiar. That love, relationships, whatever, they're not some definition in a book. They're what we get within our family. That's what our culture tells us, right? That's what we're taught. And so it's not that we go out looking for the abuse, looking for the narcissist.
right.
It's that on an unconscious level, we're recognizing those relationships as familiar. And the disastrous part of it is why it makes it so hard for us to leave, is because as a child you can't leave, right? So you're given this dysfunctional relationship dynamic as a child, and as an adult you would say, okay, these are red flags, I'm just going to leave. But the child is conditioned and taught to chase the parents' love. So instead of setting boundaries and instead of saying this is unacceptable and leaving, we do what we were conditioned to do and chase the acceptance, chase the affection, chase the narcissist instead of running running the opposite direction.
Right.
I find, romantic relationships are always kind of hard for that reason of like learning to maintain a core self and actually share a space, right? Where the narcissistic parent denies their children modeling of healthy conflict, right? And a lot of relationships is healthy conflict, not like fighting, but just two perspectives sharing a space, right?
Right.
And so with a narcissist, it's either people please and surrender to them, or it all bubbles over into like World War III. And like,
Mm,
to me, a lot of the healing for us children of narcissists is learning to live within that shared space, learning without giving ourselves away, right? Without also exploding, but really learning to kind of have healthy conflict and recognize that not every conflict is a complete rupture, right? Or is a complete fracture. And that's been a challenge, but it's, I mean, I think to me it's just about continued growth in that
sure.
in that area.
And this is something that happens to so many people, right? They have a narcissistic parent and they start winding up in romantic relationships with a narcissist. And it's one of the big things that wakes people up to it. I
Yeah,
call it the sixth sense moment, right? Where you
yeah,
realize, oh, narcissistic partner, very likely you also had a narcissistic
right,
parent.
right.
And then you wake up to the world and you see it in a completely different way.
Yes. And I, in my coaching stuff, I always try to shift towards that understanding, because there's a totally natural and righteous urge when you're coming out of a romantic relationship with a narcissist to try to understand narcissism. We all do this, right? We all binge the content. It becomes this like near obsession to understanding the narcissist. But at some point we have to pivot to understanding ourselves.
Mm,
And a lot of times it is about narcissism in our family of origin, right? That the narcissistic romantic relationship is one thing, but to truly heal is to understand what our past is. It's this pivot from what was done to us in the narcissistic relationship to what it means for us. And a lot of times, we talked about this earlier, that people kind of interpret this as victim blaming, but it's actually victim empowerment. If we want to kind of make better choices in the future and we want to transcend some of these unconscious patterns, it's about us taking responsibility, right? And saying, like, narcissists exist. Right. But if I found myself in five separate relationships with them, that there's something beneath the surface that I need to look at within myself, because all the abuse is about the narcissist. Everything they do is about the narcissist. So all of the recovery has to become about us. Right. And to me, the antidote to narcissistic abuse is authenticity, vulnerability, and responsibility. Right. Of being authentic, being vulnerable, because they take those things away from us. They can't be those things, but then really owning responsibility for our life. Because I worry sometimes, like when I think of my recovery and the life I lead now and how it's all on me now. That's both good and bad. It's scary, actually. So there's some sort of, I don't want to say comfort, but there's something we get used to when the narcissist is controlling our lives, that like we don't have ownership over our lives. I really also believe narcissists deny their children a sense of ownership of anything. But to take that ownership of our lives means owning the good and the bad and accepting it all, right? It's not saying like this path is leading me to become the perfect human being. It's leading me to the acceptance of my status as a whole human being, right? Good and bad, perfect and imperfect. But I don't see us getting there if we just keep focusing on the
Sure.
narcissist, right? Like I've come to believe that there's two conversations. There's the understanding of narcissism, and there's the recovery from narcissistic abuse. And there might be a little Venn diagram or, kind of overlapping circles, but they're separate conversations, and that we have to actually center ourselves in the healing process. Otherwise, it's just an extension of the abuse where we're centering the narcissist. The idea is to kick the narcissist out of our minds, right? Like
Yeah.
they kind of like, I call it, they colonize us. They overtake our seat of consciousness, and we have to kind of claim it, but it's not as simple. It's
I call unsubscribing. You got to
Yeah, I
unsubscribe
like
from
that.
their
Yeah, yeah,
distorted version of
yeah,
reality. And I
yeah.
mean, and even in our space, right? Accountability is almost like a curse word to a lot of people because they'll instantly say the victim blaming thing. But
Right,
it's like you said, the power is on our side of the street. And when we
right.
empower ourselves to do that, that's when we can move forward. And just because we look at our side of the street doesn't mean the abuse was our
That's all
fault.
we can control, right? Is our side of the street. I've had people tell me that if they can convince themselves that their ex was a narcissist, they no longer consider it a consensual relationship. And I can understand where they're coming from, right? I don't want to belittle or minimize that perspective, but I don't see that as a good springboard for healing, right?
Mhm.
Because we're choosing our partners, and people aren't doing full psych workup exchanges on the first date, right? And there's all sorts of bad people in relationships that aren't narcissists. And so to me, it's about taking ownership over our lives and our decisions, and say, if you end up with one narcissist, okay, but if it's this pattern, it has to be looking inward. It has to be questioning, why does this keep happening, right? It can't
Mhm.
just be that I'm unlucky and everybody I meet's a narcissist. There has to be some, what do you call it, accountability, responsibility, just ownership over our lives that says, I have the power to change.
Right.
These narcissists are not so powerful that I can't be, like, I think we build them up a little too much sometimes,
Because
that
think, if you don't say that, what are you saying? You're saying that you're just likely to be a powerless victim
there's
whenever.
nothing I can do, you
I
know.
can't tolerate that kind of
I can't
mindset.
either, but I mean, I've been talking about this for years, and like the victim blaming accusations come pretty quickly when I'm talking like this. But I actually see it as empowerment of saying you have the power, right? It's only through the acceptance of the responsibility that we can choose differently, right? It's only through the acceptance that, okay, I've now had this many relationships with narcissists. How can I not wind up in this situation again? Because it's fucking hell,
Yeah, it's
like,
pretty
and
clear
they
to
are.
me.
There's no real. I mean, there's no real way to know. That's the thing. People want to know, how can you tell if there's a narcissist? You can look subtly at, like, are they allowing for your perspective in things? I mean, there are subtle clues, but ultimately, like, that's always the question. What's a red flag that means narcissist, and what's just like, it's never going to be um a simple thing, right? Like, there needs to be a large sample size of behavior in certain ways to truly make that call. And like, to me, like, what I didn't want to do was close myself off to love or to relationships by seeing narcissism everywhere, by seeing one little red flag and writing everybody off based on insufficient data, basically. um, but again, these are hard things to talk about, because, like, talking about personal responsibility in relationship spaces, in mental health issues, there's a needle to thread in recognizing the reality of narcissism and how they do. We, on one level, we walk right into it, but they do that by mirroring us, by the love bombing thing, where they're shapeshifters in a certain way. I mean, I
Sure.
think somebody said it. It's like it begins as like a shared fantasy where they're reflecting back to you this version of yourself that's a good version, right? When they're
Yeah.
idealizing you. And so I don't want to, like, I always almost feel guilty when I talk like this, because I recognize how it can be interpreted, but we have to really narcissistic abuse and the understanding of it, like so much of it is linguistic, right? And that like changing language, what they do is they use language to create reality, right? They don't describe reality, they create it. But we have to kind of do that too and be very, very precise in how we choose to talk to ourselves about these things. Because like part of me hates this idea of victim mentality, especially for scapegoats, because like the reality is some of us are victims and we haven't figured that out yet. And so there is truth in accepting the victimhood, but it has to be moved through, right? It
Mm,
can't be the destination. And so um
mhm.
survivor becomes the word, right? Not victim, because we are victimized by this stuff, but like I don't want to go through my life. The narcissist tries to put you on themselves on top and you on the bottom. And linguistically, if we get too caught up in the victimhood, we maintain that bottom position, right? And so I'm a firm believer in the power of language, of
Right.
like shifting our reality is shifting the language that we use to describe it. That language is magic in a lot of ways. Like we
I
have,
agree.
it's become so ingrained in the human experience that we don't really understand how much language structures our reality. Different, somebody who speaks Sanskrit from birth, for instance, lives in a functionally different reality than somebody that speaks English. Now, we're experiencing the same things, but it's actually real, right? That like the language dictates the reality. We see this in politics with propaganda. What is propaganda if not narcissistic language use, where it's using language to create reality, not define it, right?
Right.
And so to me, like there's been so much power, and I'm an English major, so I mean it works, but it's like in shifting all of this language, right? In understanding part of our power is and part of the narcissistic abuse is how we talk to ourselves. That narcissistic introject injects their language into our own consciousness, right? I mean, especially like narcissistic parents who become our inner critic, right? And so shifting linguistically, I mean, whether it's through mantra work or affirmations, which seem really stupid, but like I don't think they are. Like I think that they can kind of go overboard, and the whole Stuart Smalley stuff is kind of funny when you think about talking to yourself in that way. But we change our thoughts by changing our thoughts, right? And so if we're having these intrusive thoughts that are rooted in this experience, then consciously altering what language we're using and what we're thinking can begin the process of thinking differently,
Right.
of relating to ourselves differently.
I think a big thing also too is people don't want to you don't want to make being a victim a permanent part of your identity. It can
No,
be a temporary thing where you want to move through it, but it
right.
shouldn't be a permanent aspect. And I think you mentioned another good thing in there too where you mentioned you feel guilty even talking about the personal responsibility and accountability.
Mhm.
And I think that's where the audiences on social media, they influence us, that we
Yeah.
can
Oh
be
yeah.
captured by our audiences where we might want to talk
Who's the
about
real
something.
follower?
Yeah. So we're following the people that they're
Well,
going to
that
rip us.
I think a lot of creators become the followers because they
Yeah.
just go where the engagement takes them. It's been really hard. I mean, when I started doing this, I had no intention of getting followers, right? It was me wanting to hear myself speak about this experience of narcissistic parents. I was totally unhinged. Like my hair was crazy. Like I made a point of like not no production value, no like I'm just showing up and talking into the phone like I'm sitting in a support group meeting, right? And I would say, like, I don't give a fuck about followers. But then 4 years later, over the various accounts, it's been like 500,000 to 1 million followers, so much engagement that it invades our brain, and it's designed that way. And so it takes a lot of mental fortitude and intention I mean, to be honest, I'm struggling with that right now. Like I'm too aware of my audience. There's a great Allen Ginsberg quote, and it says, if you want to find your voice, forget about people hearing it. Right. And
Mm,
I think of social media as like the exact opposite, where it's like the voice is tailored to what the audience wants to hear far too often. And how can I maintain talking about what I want to talk about, being authentic, being vulnerable in this kind of, it's very hard. I mean, it doesn't feel nearly as safe nowadays on social media. Um, I don't I used to be able to just turn the thing on and it was like just vomiting forth, right? And now you get trapped in your mind a little bit. It's really interesting, though. I think in a lot of ways, the internet, social media has affected, how and what we think so much that it's like it's a new, this follower creator or whatever, these relationships are new in human history, right? And it's just like anything, it's neither good nor bad, it's both, right? And it's
Right.
trying to figure out how and why, how can I both honor my audience but also honor myself, right?
Mm,
How can I maintain core self when one thing I found is like my main goal was authenticity, but then you begin to realize like I can be as authentic as I can, but in a 3-minute video that's bouncing out to thousands of people, they're all going to interpret me through their lens, right? And so like somebody called me like a self-styled expert, or I'm not I just share my thoughts, right? And so if people then think this guy's this thing or that thing based on just me authentically sharing, that's not about me self-styling myself as anything. This has always just been about me sharing my thoughts, sharing my life in a lot of ways. And I think um, it's
I
just
think
really interesting.
that's where it comes down to our priorities, right? Where like is our priority maintaining the audience? Is our priority turning it into the business? Or is our
Yeah, yeah.
priority just being authentic and sharing what we want? Or do we try to really find the perfect mix
Well, I
of
think
all those three?
that's where it gets really difficult, is that like money gets involved, and like the followers and the engagement are like Pavlovian conditioning, right? They're
Mm,
literally playing in our brains, and especially me. I've struggled with addiction and dopamine issues my whole life. That it is very hard to kind of not look at engagement, or not base my self-worth based on views or whatever, which is really out of our control. The algorithms do the algorithms thing. I'm convinced they turn faucets on and off, and that it's not, social media is not nearly as organic. It used to be like on TikTok, like maybe like 2021 when I started, you could see like a video would you could see it gaining momentum, right? Like you could see like, okay, there's like a ratio, maybe like 1 like to 10 views, and then it would put itself in the algorithm that way. It's not like that anymore. I mean, once TikTok started like sending emails like pay us for views, then you have to assume if they're charging you for views, they're throttling you, right? Like they're not
mm,
they're not going to give the thing away for free. And so it's been really hard for me not to take that personally, actually, to like see these ebbs and flows in engagement or ebbs
right.
and flows in views as a value judgment on content, and not just algorithmic bullshit. But I really think it's algorithmic bullshit,
It
that.
is, and it's really difficult to separate yourself as a creator because it does give you an ego boost a
Yeah,
little bit. Like you get a viral video,
yeah.
you'll especially if you're new to getting viral videos, you're gonna feel pretty like your head's gonna
It's
blow
like
up a little
drugs,
bit.
man. Like having a video like watched like a couple million times in like a 24 or 48-hour period. And if you're paying attention to everything, it's like a blackout almost. There's just so much engagement. It's overstimulating. And then, again, like this is really like ugly to talk about almost, but it's intentional. They're designing things this way. They're designing it on the user end, on the viewer end, and they're designing it on the creator end, and like um it's I think this is so obvious, and people talk about this, that like the drugs of the future are technology, right? The oncoming mental health disorders will all be related to technology, right? AI psychosis, social media addiction, phone addiction, because we've allowed them to design these devices in ways that are manipulating our psychology, like it's all Pavlovian conditioning, like all these little dings. These devices did not have to be designed this way, right? Like they are designed in a way to capture our attention, right? To create engagement. And every time we hear the word engagement coming from a platform or a tech company, we should think targeted addiction, right? If what they want is us on their products, on their platforms as much as possible, they are manipulating us to keep us there, right? It's also why the algorithms are driven by fear and anger. It's because those things animate the human mind and hold people's attention longer than cat videos and puppies, and I keep getting burned on like animal AI videos. Like my girlfriend's
they're
always
all
like,
they're
"You're
all
like a
over.
boomer. You just fell for one." I saw like this one. It's like this old lady and like a big bear that she's feeding, and I'm like, "Oh, that's
Yeah,
really cool."
I've seen that one too.
Yeah, like that's not AI. But
Was it
yeah,
the social media algorithm? I always say, just like a narcissist, because
yeah,
it feeds off of both positive and negative
yeah,
attention. You get
yeah,
angry, you think you're doing something to hurt the creator. No, you commented, it's going to reward that creator for doing whatever they did. And so, but
yeah.
the algorithm does not like indifference, just like a
No.
narcissist doesn't like indifference.
No. I always said about the comment sections too. I always wanted to point out to the commenters, if you just saw a 1 minute video of me and you're making this broad sweeping statement, your comment says more about you than it does about me, because you don't fucking know me. And you're talking about things that, it's just always funny to me, because it's like, I really, I'm half joking, but like, I think comment sections have ruined the world, right? That like the rhythm of conversation, how polluted they are with bots and fake people setting the terms. I just think, um, I think, we were talking a little bit about this. I really think all of the destabilization we're going through in the world is a result of shifting to the internet and social media as information systems. That like the shift from like the television, print, old media, reality, and information systems into this social media, internet stuff. It's destabilized all of our kind of social, economic, and political systems in a lot of ways. And we should, I just made a video, I think yesterday, about this, like managing our relationship to technology and information is one of the most important relationships we have now. That we have to consciously curate what it is we're putting into our minds, because we're being assaulted with so much bullshit.
Right. I mean, and what I see just in these comment sections is people are just unable to disagree in a mature way.
Yeah,
They'll instantly lash out, instantly invalidate. And we can make a video, we can make 100 videos people agree with. And then you make one video, oh, you have no idea what you're talking about. What are
right,
your credentials, by the way?
right. Or like, well, I usually agree with you, as though agreement, like as though we have to agree with 100% of what somebody says in order to listen to them. You said it. We have forgotten how to disagree as a culture. We have forgotten that disagreements drive conversations forward. A lot of it is because of the parameters of what we've all been disagreeing on have totally jumped the shark, right? But like that zero sum or black and white kind of conversing is really damaging, right? I mean, I always say it's the difference between like how people interact online, and then like my landlord will come over and we have different views on stuff, and we're buddies and we sit here talking about shit that we disagree on, right? But there's not this level of like, I don't want to call it hatred, but just distance between people, right? And I think we really need to remember how to actually like it shouldn't have to be 100% agreement on everything, right? It shouldn't. It always drives me nuts, like when they do that, like, oh, I usually agree with you, but here, I don't. I mean, I don't want to be rude, but it's like I don't fucking care. I don't know you. Like your agreement's not necessary. Um, but yeah,
I mean, the big thing is all it takes now is one minor disagreement to end friendships or to ruin opportunities. Like that's all
yeah,
it takes. Someone
yeah.
disagrees with you, they don't want to be
I've
your friend.
found this affecting me, that like I think I think I've had to like check myself a little bit when like when I started, I was fine with everybody disagreeing. Just this, like I feel like I've had that affect me, where I've become less tolerant of disagreements, very quick on the block button. And I'm not sure it's healthy. Although, I think for creators, the block button is actually self care. I know like the followers get kind of mad. They'll say this person blocked me for this person blocked me for that. But it's like when you're dealing with hundreds of thousands of people, and your content is out there, you're in very little control of it, and so it's actually a mechanism of control. I always say it's like, say I'm sitting at a bar and some guy sits down and starts just talking shit nonstop. I'm going to get up and move, right? And so, I think it's such a change in how we communicate. It's such a radical like the internet and social media, it's so radically different than for those of us that are in middle age or whatever, than what we grew up with, that we have to kind of carve out our space. I mean, I always think like just because I'm existing in public doesn't mean everybody gets access to me. If they say things that are hostile, or they're constantly just you know tearing down, then why what's the point, you know?
I totally think the block buttons for self care as a creator. And I think there's a big difference between an antagonistic, combative, and
Yeah,
hostile
yeah,
disagreement
yeah,
versus an okay, we can have a discussion here about this, we can disagree.
yeah,
But a
yeah,
lot of people just go straight to that antagonism and
yeah,
combativeness,
exactly.
and that's very unpleasant.
The like hate followers, there are people that will follow you just to like hate on you, and I'm always like, don't you have something better to do? Because it's not disagreement, it's attacks, right? Where it's like even like the credential ask for me is always kind of funny, because like it's basically saying the person doesn't understand what's being talked about and they need a cheat sheet. I always give the story, like I used to have a Twitter account. I tweeted at Bandy Lee about narcissism once, and she didn't go, "What are your credentials?" She just retweeted me and said, "I've never thought about it this way," because she had the context to understand what I was saying, and had the information to engage. She didn't need the credentials. And again, this isn't against credentials, but it's like, to me, that ask is basically saying, I can't engage with the topic, so I'm going to engage with the speaker, right? It's an admission that they're not understanding, what they don't have the background or the context to understand
Right.
what's being said.
They're
Because
appealing
like
to
I talk
authority.
about human consciousness, we're all experiencing it. So like what credential do I need to talk about psychology? I'm a fucking human being. Western psychology gets most things wrong. As Jiddu Krishnamurti says, it's no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society. That society doesn't really have an understanding of consciousness that I think is really where it needs to be. And so those things are kind of funny to
Right.
me.
And those are the people that are appealing to authority, right? They want
Right.
you to have some certain piece of paper. It's similar to the people that want to say, oh, you need a peer reviewed study to prove
Right.
what you just said. And they call
Right.
that sea lioning.
A peer reviewed study of mental health, that's consciousness. You can't observe another person's internal life. So, in a very real way, there's no scientific study of human consciousness. The only consciousness you can actually observe is your own. You can look at brain scans or you can look at physical matter, but that's not the same as human consciousness. And that there's no scientific study of consciousness because it can't be observed or quantified other than through manifestations of behavior. And those behaviors don't come from a normalized experience. It can be the same behavior functioning completely different. And so I don't know. I mean,
It's interesting. Now, I wanted to run this by you too. Sam Vaknin, he had said this, I think 5 years ago, but he was talking about autistic people or people what they used to call with Asperger's. And he had said
mhm,
there are some autistic people that develop a layer of narcissism to protect themselves because direct contact with the world as
mhm.
an autistic person is so painful and uncomfortable. And I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, yeah, I think like artistic masking, right, could be viewed from a certain lens as similar to the grandiose false self of a narcissist. I don't think the grandiosity is there. And again, this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. I don't think the internal function is the same as the narcissist, but I think when we're looking at it through just the lens of observable behaviors, that they can appear in certain situations to be the same, right? But I think a lot of times an autistic person is masking to try to connect, to try to feel part of a group or of a social setting, whereas the narcissist is masking to manipulate and to present. That this is a perfect example of what I was just talking about. That it's on the surface very similar behaviors, but coming from a very different place. And so I think, I mean, I consider myself on the spectrum, and I think that there's I think of narcissism as like the tyranny of perspective, of somebody that's living in their own disordered perspective, right? That can't recognize other people's perspectives. I think that can kind of appear in autism sometimes as well, right? Where I know when I get frustrated or I get triggered, I have triggers related to what like being misunderstood or mischaracterized. I tend to have like a real shutdown. And is that autism? Is that CPTSD? I mean, I kind of look at it like, um, children of narcissists are always mischaracterized and misunderstood, and they live this life of wanting to be understood. And I link it to that, but I don't know what clinically they would call it. Like I see a lot of my own pathology through the ways that it was shaped by the pathologies of my caregivers. That human consciousness doesn't really exist in a vacuum. It exists in relation to other consciousnesses, right? Like I was saying to you earlier, like take an infant, put them in a padded room for the first 10 years of their life. What would their language skills look like? What would their consciousness look like? These are not entitlements, they're cultural downloads.
Mm.
And so, this is where the genetic thing gets interesting. Is it environmental? Is it genetics? I can see a lot of my own dysfunction, let's call it, through the lens of my experience having disordered parents, through of um that it's shaped that way. But again, I don't know that there's going to be definitive answers to this stuff. It's
Mm.
it's more just, I think, food for thought.
That's something I want to ask you too. Having a narcissistic parent as an autistic person, how do you think that shaped it for you?
Well, I think for me, like the narcissistic parent kind of like, I really believe narcissistic abuse exists on a conscious level and a subconscious level, and that it's rooted in the linguistics, like in the way the narcissist constructs language over time, relating to I and you and all of these things. Um, and that the children of narcissists, much like the partners, that they call it the narcissistic introject, but what that kind of is with the children, that they create this like unconscious filter, right, where everything is filtered through, is this safe, right? Is it? And it's never safe to be authentic. It's never safe for me to, if a narcissist can't recognize they're hurting you, they're not going to recognize you're hurt, right? And so this is where the authentic self becomes suppressed. And so I see a little bit of that, and again, it's difficult for me to kind of separate CPTSD and the autistic qualities that I see in myself. But it's hard for me to separate from this kind of denial of my authentic self within my family unit, and so it's like the dad denies it, then you go home to the mom and everything explodes, and then that's
Mm.
punished, right? And so it's the denial on one hand, the bubbling up volcanic release of those denied emotions on the other hand, and neither one is a healthy, it's not a healthy expression for the child, but it's more importantly not a healthy environment created by the parents. Like, I didn't know why I was so angry, right? um so I don't know if I answered the question. It's hard to kind of, it's hard for me to talk about autism because like I don't want to offend people, and I know in my mind, like it just, I know it to be true, right? That like there are just elements of my entire life story, that it just seems very true. But being that I spent 40 years not identifying that way, it's a weird thing, to be honest, like to kind of like begin to see our consciousness through different labels, basically, right? Where I grew up being told I was angry, I was depressed, being sent to therapy. And so seeing it through this one lens, and then all of a sudden the dam breaks when you start to understand, oh, well, this was all actually pretty normal responses to the chaotic and abusive environment I was growing up in. And it's, I think a lot of us in middle age are having these awakenings and coming into new awareness of ourselves. And it's, at least in my experience, bittersweet, kind of, that it helps to have a framework, but it also kind of, I'm not sure how to relate to all of it. I'm not sure what it means, basically. I mean, it helps me explain, specifically some of the struggles, and some of the quirks, some of the kind of like ways I experience life, people. But if I'm being honest, it sometimes makes me feel limited too. And it interrupts like healing from CPTSD versus accepting autism, and like, I don't think autism is something you heal from, right? And so,
Mm. Now, there's no you can manage, I would say, right? You
Yeah,
can.
yeah, it's about awareness and acceptance and tailoring a life. But I don't know. I mean, I have this feeling that we've gone overboard in pathologizing human existence, that we have too many labels, that the mental health care landscape is like this maze that doesn't actually have an exit, right? That like it's giving us all this language and understanding, but there's really no clarity. There's no the objectivity is kind of like a ghost. I mean, I'm not sure these things are quite as objective as we, like medical science, for instance. Now I don't want to get on my anti-DSM soapbox, but it's like by piggybacking the payment system of mental health on physical health, they brought it into this realm of needing objective diagnosis. And so they create all of these diagnoses and criteria as billing codes, but it ends up being identities for all of us in certain ways. And I just don't, people may not like this, but I just don't see the DSM as an objective scientific manual. I just don't. I think that those are different forms of consciousness. They're created, not discovered. Nobody discovered these things. You can't take narcissism out of somebody's body and observe it like you can with cancer. And I think like it's not to throw all of it out, but it's to say we need to be more clear. Literature studies is part of my degree. And so when you look at a piece of writing, the first thing you ask is, what is the intent of this piece of writing? And I think the intent of what the DSM is not the way it's functioning in broader culture, right? The intent of kind of like insurance billing and codifying these things so therapists can get paid isn't the same as like attempting to understand human consciousness, which is essentially what they're talking about, are aspects of human consciousness. I don't think the illness model works, to be completely honest. I think if you're defining illness, you have to define health. And this is the Gabor Mate myth of normal stuff. What's healthy? What is the normal brain? I don't. I think there are pathologies and brains and minds that fit us into the capitalist system that we live in, the cultural system that we live in. Sometimes when I think of neurotypicality, I just think of a brain that's culturally conditioned properly, right? And that doesn't get into brain chemistry or brain structure, but it gets into what the cultural expectations are for us, which to me is like participating in this consumer contest with a smile and
Mm,
sacrificing meaning for consumption. That
mhm.
I don't know. I mean, to me, it's I don't know if this is weird. It just always strikes me as wrong that, like, say somebody's struggling with what we call mental health, and they go to a therapist, and the therapist throws all these illnesses at them. Does that help them?
I don't think usually. I mean, it can to an extent if like getting that label can put you on the path
Yeah.
to like learning about
But the
yourself.
labels themselves, right? The language themselves, like when a lot of this to me is trauma, right? That a lot of this, like when I think of like being called depressed or anxious, I see it more as part of this constellation of CPTSD that like, um, but again, I don't, I mean, it's just, I think we should be questioning all of these definitions and all of the language. And again, like, just like everything, people should use the language that works for them. People should use the modalities that work for them. So it's never, I never want to pretend that what I'm saying is like telling people not to do this or to do that. It's to just think critically about what we're being taught about our mental health and understanding it's not coming from the same scientific study as physical health. That there's more ambiguity and more subjectivity in how we choose to view these things, right? Than,
Right.
than there would be like, I have cancer or I have a broken femur or whatever.
Right, and we talked about this before we started, but when you look at the DSM and how they diagnose narcissism, they're doing that on the behaviors. And
Right.
I think it's more important to diagnose the operating system is
Right.
more important.
Same. No, I think the diagnostic criteria of narcissism is exactly how we've arrived at a place where everybody's calling everybody else a narcissist, because you're defining them through these behavioral traits that all sorts of people do. All sorts of people lie. All sorts of people cheat. All sorts of people gaslight. Like, and I think it's about how those, to me, pathological narcissism is an operating system. That it's not like, think of the diagnostic criteria as lines of code, right? That when we're saying 5 out of 9, to me, like it almost makes a mockery of pathological narcissism to imply that you can be diagnosed as a narcissist but yet have empathy. Right, that like one of the defining characteristics to me of pathological narcissism is to be unable to see outside your own perspective, which is to say unable to deploy empathy. Right. And don't even get me started on cognitive empathy. If it's in the mind of a narcissist and it's cognitive empathy, they will only deploy empathy when it's in their best interest. And so forgive me for not defining that as empathy, because it's decidedly not.
Well, people
It's
will also say the empathy scale or the spectrum of empathy.
yeah,
What do you think
yeah.
about that?
I guess. I mean, I kind of think of empathy as a feeling, as a unconscious ability to kind of understand there are other people with other experiences, other emotional states, and that, like, to think about it, thinking about feelings isn't feeling feelings, right? There's a big problem in our culture with this, that we spend too much time thinking about our feelings and not enough time feeling them. And so if you're thinking about empathy, you're not feeling it, right? And so a spectrum, sure. I mean, I mean, I, I guess, I don't know. It drives me nuts, that 5 out of 9 traits thing. It just really, like, I just think it waters down what it is to deal with a pathological narcissist, right? That it's not these 5 out of 9 traits. It's this very different form of consciousness. I mean, I get into these weird theories of like primordial mind, and like I tend to think narcissism is an undeveloped consciousness, an undeveloped ego, somebody that doesn't actually individuate, therefore sees themselves as the world, right? Like a schizophrenic hears things, I just watched that Geen show, which was kind of a fucking mess. But this description of schizophrenia really resonated, where it was that your left and right hemisphere don't communicate, right? And so they'll hear elements of mind but prescribe them to outside sources. Like they're personifying external sources for internal dialogue, basically. To me, the narcissist is almost like the reverse of that, where they're experiencing their self by placing it outside of themselves, which is why they're projecting, why they're telling you how you feel when it's actually how they feel, why they get confused about causality. Because there's one thing, they say now, it's like, well, every accusation is a confession. But the question is, like, are they doing that, like, intentionally, or is that about actually displacement of self? I tend to think, and I think that can be both. Like, I don't want to say one or the other, but I think they lack the container of self. They have a grandiose false self, and that needs to be preserved by how they're being perceived. Therefore, they have to displace the components of self, emotional state, responsibility for action, onto the world around them in order to preserve their grandiose false self. And this is how their mind, how their consciousness is operating. But there's no way, I mean, there's no way to know any of that,
For sure, for sure. I mean, and that's what Sam Vaknin would say. He would say that about the confabulation too. And to you, what is the core of narcissism?
Well, I talk poorly about a lot of self-aware narcissists. I kind of have a soft spot for Sam Vaknin. I don't, I mean, he says don't trust him, but I kind of like his professorial, like, delivery or whatever. And so I think the core is defense against the world, right?
Mm,
They have a undeveloped core self that needs to be defended from reality, which is why they're all about power and control, because power and control is safety, right? And so when I think of narcissism, I think like the grandiose false self is essentially like Charles Barkley setting a pick in basketball for this lack of it's a defense mechanism, right? Which is why when you poke at them, right, when you penetrate that false self, when you bring them a dose of reality, right, they rage, because that cuts to the core of who they are, which to me is like an infant. That their core self is only capable of basically rage, right? They don't have developed authentic emotions. And so they're defended against the world. And everything that they're doing is to control reality as a defense mechanism against the exposure of this, some people call it the paranoid schizoid core, right? That in Melanie Klein's object relation theory, that they don't graduate into the depressive position, which is actually, like, according to these theories, like, in the paranoid schizoid position of childhood, infancy, whatever, the child can only see good and bad, right? Which is like a narcissist. They can't see good and bad in the same container. And so to graduate into the depressive position would be to recognize an object as both good and bad. And in that recognition, the ability to feel guilt is formed, right?
Mm.
And so this is why they can't feel guilt, is because they're trapped in this underdeveloped consciousness, right? We have to think of like evolution of consciousness both on the evolutionary scale, right? We were talking about this earlier, where narcissism, autism as genetic. When we think about the evolution of the human brain, which is the most complex grouping of matter the universe has yet produced, we have all of this evolutionary history from single-celled organism up to the human mind. And so the idea that there would be one normalized mind or experience of consciousness is impossible, right? And so I think we then have to look at the evolution of consciousness within an individual life, right? And when a child is born, an infant, they don't have a sense of self. I think when the narcissists are projecting their emotional state, it's much like an infant crying out. It's just they have language. Like the infant is placing their distress outside of their body in order to get their needs met. To me, that's kind of what narcissists do.
See,
But again,
for me,
these are all like just theories of consciousness, theories of psychology, and I don't know. I don't know how we'll ever have definitive answers to this stuff.
probably not. I'll be very curious what you would think of Dr. George Simon's work, and in particular, In Sheep's Clothing and Character Disturbance, because he goes over that distinction where he says sometimes they can be very offensive in nature. And he has that saying, it's not that they don't
But
see,
the
they
best
disagree.
defense is a good offense, right?
Well, they'll say that too. They'll say that too.
But yeah. I mean, I think I think narcissism can look very different. It's based on, like my dad. He's a yoga meditation teacher. I don't think, like, in my years of describing him and talking about this, I don't think anybody would have an actual understanding of what he's actually like, right? And so, well, like grandiosity and victimhood, they would seem at odds, but there can be grandiosity in victimhood, because narcissists are in this never-ending cycle of grandiosity and victimhood. But they can have grandiosity in their victimhood, right?
Sure.
And so I think
It's a covert way to get attention on them a lot of times, I see.
right. Part of it is like, see, I think narcissism, why it's so squirrely is it kind of hides in cultural norms and expectations. Part of that is linguistic, and that like a relationship with a narcissist. Is that really a relationship, how we think of them? It's more a relationship like a parasite to a host, where they're extracting supply, not creating connection. And so it defies our linguistic expectations of human behavior and internal experiences of these things. And I don't think the English language has a lot of, like, the psychological language isn't there. It's either far too like clinical and like academic, or it's too blunt. That we don't have good language for this stuff. We're a culture rooted in I, in the self, but not, and in the material world, not in the internal world. That this is relatively new for us. I'm reading this book about a cocaine cartel in Miami. It's pretty good. I think it's who Scarface is after. But they were. Oh no, I just lost what I was going to say. Yeah, never mind.
Well, you'll think about it in a minute.
I'll think about it. Yeah, it was some. Yeah.
Here's a question I had for you. Do you believe in healthy narcissism?
Yeah, I think we all have narcissistic traits. Again, getting back to this linguistic thing and the culture of I, right? This culture we have that's rooted so much in individuality and the self, that we need. So I think that term egoism, right? It is like the absence of the healthy narcissism in a certain way, where we lack what Bessel van der Kolk calls the reflex of purpose, right? And so we need to be able to impose our perspective on people, right? We need to be able to act in our own self-interest in order to survive. And so I do think I think we all need actually a healthy level of narcissism. But to me, it's about the malleability. the range of possible behaviors, that the pathological narcissism, the damaging narcissism, is because they're trapped in it and they can't behave outside of it,
Right.
right? And so the healthy narcissism would come with the ability to act in different ways, right? And not simply that way.
I guess I've had problems with calling it healthy narcissism because I don't necessarily think that confidence and self respect would necessarily be that. And I
Yeah.
think, I guess the follow up question to that is when you say everyone has narcissistic traits, what do you mean when you say that?
Well, when we look at the 9 narcissistic traits, I'd have to look at them. I don't think like anybody's free from all of them. I mean, it depends on, I guess it depends on how we're defining narcissistic traits, but I just
Yes.
think we live in a culture that has so many narcissistic systems, right? That like this this idea of narcissism as the tyranny of perspective, right? Like think of nationalism, right? Like think of telling our national story only from our perspective, right? Without regards to other cultures, or even we'll just use an easy example, the Native Americans, right? Like without telling the story of the pilgrims coming here, without making space for that there were people already here, right? To me, this singular perspective, like what they would call the monoculture, is cultural narcissism, right? That narcissism defines the reality. Like I see narcissism in the colonial experience, right? Where I call narcissism interpersonal colonialism, because what the narcissist does is come in and try to control your reality, right? And so we see this, and this isn't to make a value judgment on any of this shit. Shit happens the way it happens, and people get all like up in arms about like making value judgments on this stuff, when what I want to do is just try to figure it out and see it accurately. Um, but it's a metaphor, because it's the colonial experiences coming in and placing religion, placing language, controlling the reality as much as the land, right? And to me, that is narcissistic. That the idea of assimilation, like what you would do is assimilate into the narcissist reality or be abused. And so um, it's interesting, because again, like I see these things like narcissism as a specific form of consciousness, and individual consciousness is reflected in social systems, right? Like these social systems are the products of human consciousness. And so, of course, there's this kind of like repetition on a social scale of what we're experiencing individually. I mean, politics, when done wrong, is narcissism. When it's ideology, to me, is almost when I choose this ideology, I refuse all others.
Sure.
When I adopt this one framework of thought, I shut my brain off. And when I believe that my ideology is the right ideology, then I close myself off to the nuance of taking, like people have the communist capitalist debate. What if it's just pulling things from different things and trying to figure out what works, right? That none of these systems exist in their pure theoretical forms anyway. But I don't know how I got on that, but
Well, we'll
it's
get there. We'll get there in one second. I guess the way I've seen the narcissistic traits part in everyone is I think anyone can do narcissistic behaviors, like the behaviors of a
yeah, yeah.
narcissist. I
Maybe
think
that's
that's
better.
different, though, than a narcissistic operating system. And I think a trait is something that's like in you. Like this is something that's inherently a part of you.
Yeah.
And I don't know if everyone can have a narcissistic trait in that regard. Just like
Yeah,
I
I
don't
don't
think
know.
everyone would have a narcissistic operating system. But that doesn't mean that they couldn't still do those behaviors. They can still do toxic behaviors, lie, cheat,
Yeah, yeah,
steal,
yeah.
or
I mean,
whatever.
again, I think it gets into language, like how
Yeah.
we're defining these things, and that's what I mean. Like, to me, it's like looking at this again, kind of the culture centered around the individual. I just think puts into us. Yeah, I guess it depends on how you're defining traits.
Right.
How
And
you're.
that's like I don't like I say also, I don't think
Maybe you're
everyone
right. Like
has
we could all behave in narcissistic ways, right? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
well, it's like I don't think everyone has a grandiose sense of self or
No.
impaired empathy or a sense of entitlement or is exploitative in all of their relationships. But people might do an action of one
Yeah,
of those
yeah, yeah.
occasionally. That's
Yeah.
what I would think it is.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
I'm not
yeah.
saying I'm
I
right.
think that's what I meant. Maybe like the traits definition isn't there, but I think maybe that is better of saying we can all act narcissistically, right? But we're not all pathological narcissists. But I mean, I think like the grandiose false self, it's like people go out to work, they put on their suit, they put on their business, costume, and we're in a competitive masking culture, right? Where nobody wants to really show their authentic feelings out in the public square, So I do think there's a lot of narcissism culturally that is reflected in whether it's traits or behavior. I don't know, but I think there's a reason narcissists, you know, tend to thrive in a lot of situations, why they correlate with CEOs and like I was always laughing because you read about like Steve Jobs and his supposed like superpower of reality distortion. And I'm going, well, that sounds like a little something else. I was listening to like this book called The Empire of AI that's kind of about open AI and ChatGPT and all that stuff. And you get that vibe out of Sam Altman a little bit too in their descriptions. And you see that like this tyranny of perspective that's narcissism works well as a corporate leader in a lot of ways. If you can get everybody to, if like you look at narcissist as a culture of one, right? That in a corporate structure creates the culture that it can work. I mean, eventually it butts up against their blind spots and their inability. Eventually empathy and the ability to think outside yourself becomes a strength. But I think that to me, that intersection of business and narcissism is really interesting. That business leadership and the ability to impose your will on people and to impose your reality on people can be a real strength in certain situations, but then a disaster in others. And I wouldn't even call that healthy narcissism because I've seen it with my father and his partner, and their accountant ended up in prison. There can it can go very wrong very quickly.
I mean, do you think we're in a epidemic of narcissism right now?
I think social media has created a new layer of consciousness, your online self, and this anonymous, for a lot of people, behavior. And I think that online self can very easily mimic narcissism. I think I do actually, but I think that's kind of like where the culture's there is a clinging to the old narcissistic systems, and there are people seeing outside of them. I think the culture is going through cultural shadow work, in fact, and that is like coming into the awareness of who we've said we are and who we actually are, and how integrating that into a whole, and how some elements of the culture can't do that and they're melting down and lashing out. Other elements of the culture are getting there halfway. Other elements of the culture are there, but it's I really think that a lot of the cultural problems, political problems we're having are actually about group psychology, and they're not about like intentive political choices. For instance, that a person's worldview. I believe facts over feelings is a load of bullshit. That it's always feelings over facts. That like facts are more malleable than ever, and the reality is it's how we feel about things. There's a great book. It's called The Strange Order of Things: Life, Feelings, and the Makings of Culture by Antonio Damasio, who's this brilliant like neuroscientist, philosopher slash psychology guy at USC. But think about that: life, feelings, and the making of culture. And that culture is actually formed by the collective feelings of people, how we feel about things. And that part of where this culture has gone wrong is rooted in this tyranny of reason over feelings, that we've created this dichotomy or this tension between logic and feelings as though they're not inherently intertwined, right? And so um, I don't know. I feel like I'm just like rambling, but
Well,
I think like the narcissist denial of feelings can be seen in that, right? That we live in a culture that has decided feelings like depression, like mental health, all of these things. Like a smart culture would look at those things and say, what are we doing as a culture that is yielding all of these pathologies? Our culture just says there's something wrong with you. How can we make money off you? Here's some pills, right? And
Right.
and so um, I don't know. This epidemic. I think I have a book. Somebody sent me a book, The Narcissism Epidemic. I haven't read it
By
yet, but
Keith Campbell?
I think so. I can't. Yep. No, I can't really tell. It's called The Narcissism Epidemic. People send me books all the time. It's nice from my Amazon wish list, but like,
That's cool.
yeah, I think humans continue to struggle to evolve, and that's not just physical. It's mental, right? That like a lot of. I mean, I don't want to get into like, oh, ADHD is like evolution trying to adapt, but I do think there's a slivers of truth to that, right? Maybe not specifically that, although I do think like there's screens everywhere. Our Johan Hari, I don't know if you've ever read him, wrote a good book. His latest one was called Stolen Focus, about how the attention economy has basically fracturing our minds, right? And so on a certain level, the varieties of human consciousness are evolution in action, right? What's going to survive will be what's most adapted here. But I mean, I think of like I'm 47 in my lifetime. I think of what it was like as a small child, right? And like how much information we were digesting versus now, how much we were engaging with technology, how there are screens everywhere. And I have to believe that it's affecting the human mind, it's not inventing these, pathologies, but it's maybe like making them more prevalent. It's just changing the way. I mean, when I think of like social media, I think of like Facebook, right? And spending 10 years writing Facebook posts, right? And how that created like quick cuts in our mind, right? And how scrolling does that, like a movie that's really fast editing, right? Jumping from cut to cut to cut, versus like reading a book, or the old way of that's more like a long take, that's giving us time to digest, to feel. I just made a video about this, about especially in this politically chaotic time where there's a lot of disturbing imagery online and we're scrolling so fast, but we're having these micro responses, like these micro emotional responses, but it's going from like violence to like cat videos, to like, whatever. It's just taking us on this roller coaster of quick emotional cuts. And what do we do? How do we combat that? I mean, if it were up to me, I would say meditation is one of the good things to do, is to actually keep our mind keep our mind's ability to have longer focus, to
Right.
understand this relationship between our thoughts and our feelings, and that we are not our thoughts, right? We have this like movie going on in our mind of all this conditioned chitter chatter. Um, but it's a really, I mean, when I'm not terrified of the world around me and all of the chaos, it's a really interesting time for the human species.
Oh, for
It's
sure.
it's it's an inflection point, I think, like bigger than you know. I tend to look at it like the internet, and of course now AI. It's like an epoch shift. It's not just a generational shift. It's like we're going through something akin to like the transition of the industrial revolution, right? That it's a much more bigger shift than simply a generation shift.
Right. You said something before. How can society or culture do shadow work?
Well, I think that's the problem. They can't really. I think there are elements of our culture that are forcing shadow work on certain other elements. And if you force people to see the things that their mind has constructed to avoid, and you force them to do that, they don't come into new awareness. They lash out violently. They protect their delusions. Like all of us have these necessary filters on reality, right? That I was just listening to some book, I forget, but it was like saying the human mind didn't evolve for truth, it evolved for safety. And
Hmm.
part of that safety is not seeing reality clearly, right? Or having stories we tell ourselves about ourselves that aren't completely true. And so like shadow work to me is done individually. And that the problem we have now is like people ask on social media all the time, how do we wake everybody up? You don't. You're going to go like shake everybody like this and you expect everybody to go, oh yeah, now I see it. No, some of them are going to go, get your hands off me. I don't want to see that shit, you know? And I think that's where we're at, that like, when I think of our political split, without to get too political, I think a lot of it comes down to the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. Are we going to continue resting in, you know, the kind of post World War II American exceptionalist version of America? Or are we going to kind of accept that, you know, shadow work to me is about accepting our darkness and integrating with it our light, and saying we're actually both of these things, right? That we're actually like I think Democrats are Republicans shadow and Republicans are Democrats shadow.
Mhm.
That there's these competing versions of this esoteric thing called America. That what is it, right? And that it's about stories. It's about reality. It's about how people feel safe, right? What stories make them feel safe? Um, and it's just a tumultuous cultural time. I mean, I think, you know, we're a fractured culture because we're a young country. We're a cultural melting pot. You know, I think moving into the future, part of the question is how do we become so interconnected? How do we create a global culture while maintaining the beauty and individuality of other cultures, right? Of the individual cultures. Like, and I think, you know, again, I go back to the internet that's created this kind of like global village way before we might be ready for it. There's too many religions, too many languages, too many borders. You know, all of these invented reasons of disunity, right? That like, I mean, I really like Jiddu Krishnamurti as a thinker, and he talks about war and says, well, if you identify, you know, as this religion and I identify as that religion, we're at war. If you identify as this countryman or that countryman, then the tension begins in these kind of identifiers. And you know, I think that's a kind of difficult thought, but I think there's some truth to it that, you know, we have to begin seeing, you know, I don't want to get too like kumbaya, but seeing what unites us, not just focusing on what divides us. And we have, you know, again, not to get too much into this, but we have a ruling class and we have information systems and media controlled by people that want to divide us and conquer us along cultural lines so that we're not you know, we're not seeing things on a class scale, you know, through
Right.
economic lenses. And I just think um, we're in a very complicated psychological time. We see it through the lens of politics, but I really think it's cultural and psychological first, and then that manifests in the political. But
Right. Well, I think part of it is what we talked about earlier, where you and I, as creators, we have decisions to make. Okay,
yeah,
what's going to be our priority here?
yeah,
Are we going to make it a business or something? And then I think in the political commentator world, they go through something very similar, where they're like,
right,
okay, what am I going to do here? Am I going to just be truthful to what I believe,
right,
or do I want to pander to a base to get people to follow me?
right,
And I
right.
think we see what people decide.
Right, right. I told you I was listening. I love the podcast Behind the Bastards because it's honestly low key like about narcissism, even though they don't. But most of the bastards you can hear narcissism. And so there was this one about Lee Atwater, who was Reagan's political advisor, and like, you know, he has this famous quote about racism and the way that they've linked it to economics. But like, the people around him said, you know, he wasn't necessarily like this hardcore Republican. He probably could have worked on either side. It's just he just went to the Republicans, you know, and like I think there's a lot more of that, you know, behind the scenes for a lot of people that like we've created this hyper partisanship, but I'm not sure the people who've created it really believe in it as much as we would think they do. That it is like the selling of a product, the cultivating of an audience to make money. That you know,
They see it as a tool. They see it as a tool
yeah,
to get what they want,
yeah,
which is political power. But
yeah.
outside of that, I don't think they really believe in it.
No, I think it's I don't think there's enough cynicism in the world to describe our current political climate. You know, that like I hate to say that, but I just see so much cynicism that it's all just manipulation of the masses to kind of maintain the status quo rooted in economic inequality, basically.
I mean, it is a depressing thing, but it
Yeah,
is an important thing as well
yeah,
because if this stuff gets too out of hand, I mean, this is going to come to all of our
yeah,
doorsteps.
yeah.
And then it's going to impact every area of life, especially when AI gets bigger so that it starts taking more and more jobs.
Mhm.
What are humans to do?
Well, I mean, a smart culture again would be like creating a social safety net with the understanding that AI is going to create unemployment at a level that we can't really even comprehend. But there are still this misguided belief that like it's going to create jobs too. Where? Doing what?
Like,
Where? Like it's not the same as a typewriter. It's an agent with its own agency, right? And so yeah, I think we're kind of barreling off a cliff, and we can see some of the problems, but we have such a dysfunctional culture and political system. We have been so successfully divided and conquered that there's this paralysis in our political system to actually address the real problems. We've been given these cultural footballs to pass back and forth, but those are the fights they allow us to have because they don't want, it gets weird because I don't want to get into they and like all this stuff, but it's
well,
like,
but it's accurate though. I think what we know may not even really be what is going on. There can be things that we don't really
well,
know
that's
that
what
are going
Chomsky
on.
says, that Americans don't know what's going on and they don't know that they don't know what's going on. And
Yeah.
I like to think of politics through two tiers. I was telling you this, where one is literally a reality show, and that's what we're all invested in, is a reality show where we're watching it on whatever internet, TV, whatever. There's recurring characters, there's recurring themes, right? But it's this cultural football, like neoliberalism and the kind of adoption by both parties of neoliberalism has reduced our political engagement to culture wars, right? And it's taken the real, to me, political issues off the table. And so we're all involved in this reality show of politics, right? When there's the power politics, the oligarch stuff that's really driving the stuff that we don't see and we don't
Yep.
understand, right?
Yep.
And
And I don't
I'm,
think people really understand that we like they think what we know truly is what is going on, but I think there's a deeper layer to it.
I believe that to be
And a
true,
good
but
way to articulate it is this. So in I think it was the 80s, maybe
yeah,
the late 70s, there was a Russian person at a nuclear site that was told, America just launched a nuke. You better hit that button. And he didn't do it. He
right.
didn't do it. He paused and he found out it was a glitch. But the whole world didn't realize how close we all were to annihilation. And I wonder how many things like that might be going on right now that we don't even know how close we are to this brink because we're being fed this steady diet of
Well, I mean,
guns, LGBTQ, whatever else.
yeah. I think AI is like that. Like I think of AI like nuclear technology. That the nukes we lived, this last generation was nuclear extortion, basically. Whoever controlled the nukes. I mean, there was a conscious choice by our grandfathers after World War II to limit access to nuclear weapons and then make money off selling the say we can't fight because we've got nukes, we'll destroy each other. This is the Cold War was actually just a weapons selling bonanza, right? Where it
Mm,
was like, we have nukes, we can't fight directly. But like what they wanted to do was sustain the growth years of World War II, which was unsustainable, right? And so we lived through this period of nuclear extortion where we have the nukes, therefore we control everything, and then we're going to sell the second tier of weapons and get everybody fighting each other, right? And so the nuclear weapons defined the age, right? And they're also nuclear energy technology. So it was this good usage, bad usage. AI is going to be the same way. It's going to be the technology that defines this age. It's going to be a weapon first, right?
mhm.
I mean, think of it like not only can they create things that look real, they can also deny the things that are real, right? And say, well, that's just AI, right? And so you're going to have AI as the defining technology of the coming age. And I mean, I listen to a lot of smart people like the godfather of AI. I forget these people, but they're all warning. They're all ringing the warning bells. The people that aren't in line to make billions are all saying like, oh yeah, this. I mean, what's an acceptable like percentage of potential to destroy humanity, right? Like, I mean, I don't know.
It's
I
scary
mean,
times though because it's so hard to tell now what's real and what's
Yeah,
not. Like you mentioned the bear video.
yeah,
That
yeah.
bear video looks absolutely real. Like
It's,
it's
it looks real to me. Even when I was told it was AI, I'm like,
yeah.
I don't
And
know.
I saw that.
She's feeding a bear, you know.
And the same thing with when they would put words in politicians or anyone else's mouth, they can have AI of them
Well,
saying
that's the
whatever.
thing. Like you just said with that Russian thing. Like when AI of some world leader saying some crazy shit, are people going to respond in real? You know what happens if somebody? You know, I mean, it's to me, it's irresponsible. I mean, I think the technological question should always be just because we can, should we?
Ah, the Jurassic Park question.
Yeah, is that in Jurassic Park? Yeah,
Good
yeah,
old
yeah,
Ian Malcolm, I think that he said,
yeah,
"Oh yeah, you scientists are so concerned about whether you could make dinosaurs, you never stop to think whether you should." And to me, that's always the addendum that should be on the Serenity Prayer too, because they always
right.
say, "Okay, accept the things you cannot change, have the courage to change the things you can, and the
Mhm.
wisdom to know the difference." Well, the next step to that is, well, of the things you can change, what
Right.
should you
Right,
change?
right, right, right. I mean, are we going to have like Jurassic Park sometime soon? You know?
I've been seeing stuff like it. I've been seeing stuff
Can I
like
get
it.
like a pet pterodactyl? I mean, you know, where do I sign up?
People would love those. People would love
Yeah,
them. They'd be
yeah,
flying off the shelves. You kidding?
yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, it's. I think part of it too, though, is like these things are coming. You know, like there's no, you know, we're driven by profit motive. So the answer to the question is just if we can, should we? Is always if it makes money. The answer is yes. You know, and so like I think of we don't even really talk about like CRISPR and gene editing technology. There's like or CERN and you know the particle accelerator. There's just so much insane shit going on. It's head spinning. You know.
I mean, the world's going to change so much just in the next 5 years. I don't even think people are fully aware of how much it's going to change and how different life's going to look by 2030, by
Mhm,
2035. It might be
mhm.
almost unrecognizable.
Yeah. Well, I think too when people talk about AI, a lot of people see it through their interactions with you know Chat GPT or whatever of these kind of LLMs, but like the real AI, the super intelligence and the general intelligence stuff is much different and is you know to see it through the lens of like chat gpt is to kind of miss the point. You know, it'd be like seeing the future of cars through like one of those old timey basically glorified go-karts, you know.
Hmm.
And that I'm not even sure llms are truly ai as we think about it, you know, through the lens of like science fiction or whatever, that it's really wants to like not data aggregators, but like actual thinking machines, you know, and that's closer, I think, than we think. Or you know, I mean, I think they're getting. I always wonder what they, you know, like there's what we know is out there, but like what's really, you know, like what do they have for real? Like,
Well, what I'm concerned about is Elon's invention. What's it called? The mind one, where they're
oh,
trying to
Neuralink.
Neuralink. That's the one
Yeah.
that I would be concerned about. That's going to change everything if that
It's funny
works.
because like his fans were always worried about, you know, everybody putting chips, the government putting chips in us, and then they're cheering on this guy. Well, I mean, it's like I think of Musk and those. I think of him as like his own nation state, basically. That he's got more money than most GDPs. He controls satellites, missiles, AI. You know that you know when I look at him, I think of science fiction movies like Tyrell from Blade Runner or you know Wayland an alien that like to me that it's scary actually that yeah this Neuralink stuff. I mean again just because we at what point it's also weird because they're all Christians and like aren't humans okay just the way they are? Like do we need to become cyborgs basically? Like I don't you know
Which, like you said before, it's an AI arms race now.
yeah
Where if these other countries they're going to develop their AI, then America feels like they have to keep up with them,
yeah.
or else Russia or China or whomever they're going to try to use that advantage they get in the AI world over us.
It's completely logical, but it's still really dangerous to see it through
Yes.
that lens, you know, that like you know, if somebody says there's a 30% chance it destroys us, that's not worth it. And part of it is like how many billion people live on Earth and how many people are making these decisions to unleash these kind of technologies on people. It just seems it seems like a bad science fiction movie, or a really good one, but just terrifying. It's like a fun game. Like what sci-fi movies are we living in? And it's like a conglomeration of all these other things. Like I watched.
Wild times. Wild
Yeah,
times.
yeah.
Well, is there anything else you wanted to address here while I have you?
No, I think we're good.
We're good. And where can people find you online?
Well, I'm still predominantly on Instagram. I've been kind of dabbling back on TikTok a little bit. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out like a more sustainable long-term thing, but I'm in a kind of period of burnout right now. So I'm trying to like allow myself to step back if needed and kind of like give my mind a little rest. I feel like the scroll like takes over your thought process kind of, and like I don't know if you feel this, but like creating content, not having to go into a real job is nice, but it also kind of feels like my mind is always focused on it, like thinking about it, and I need to learn to like shut that off a little bit, and
It's
give.
hard to do that though, because I feel like when I do completely turn it off, I get out of rhythm.
Yeah,
And then it
yeah,
becomes more difficult to get back into rhythm. So
yeah.
it's like I'm just always have to be on. I post on all the platforms, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, and it's just a
Do you
never
post
ending
the
thing.
same content on all of those platforms, or are you doing different content, different platforms?
I eventually get them all to so I'll post at different times to each
Yeah,
platform. I
yeah.
don't post across the board all the same exact things. So I'll put like shorts on YouTube and then post them to Facebook later. And then I'll start posts on Facebook and then I'll share them to Instagram later
Mhm.
and then YouTube later. So I don't do it unanimously across the board where like just one click, they go to everyone. So
Yeah,
they're different, and then Facebook pays, and then YouTube pays, but then
yeah,
TikTok pays penance.
yeah. Yeah, yeah. I don't know. I've got to figure something out. I think I'm in one of those where I came out of it was like I was on TikTok for so long, and then like all the bullshit started happening over there. I'm like, I better cultivate another platform. And then like I blew up on Instagram for a while and got out of the rhythm of TikTok. And now the Instagram's kind of calmed down a little bit. And I'm just like, I thrive on the engagement. Like I like responding to comments. I
Sure.
kind of look at it like having a conversation. And so when the engagement kind of dwindles, like right now, I just it almost feels overwhelming with everything going on in the world, like knowing what to talk about, not wanting to kind of like add like to the doom scroll too much, like trying to find an angle um, that that isn't feeding all of that stuff so much as like maybe giving a little different vibe. Like it's I've never planned on any of this stuff, so it becomes a little hard because like it's just always been organic for me, and so I've never really felt like in the last 4 or 5 years I haven't felt this blockage that I'm feeling now. But stuff
You're
like
at a
this helps. Like
crossroads. You're at a crossroads
yeah, yeah,
where
that's what my
it's like
girlfriend was saying. Yeah,
the business is like, are you going to make this like truly a business that's going to be a career,
yeah,
or is it going to be more of a hobby?
yeah, yeah. I think that that's true. That it's just continued growth, really. Like making decisions rooted in kind of intent instead of again, like this has all just happened for me. Like I didn't ever expect to have like 5,000 followers, and like um it it just changes things, like things change, we change. And I think there's this weird thing, like for me, like sharing authentically, and when I began it was sharing my story, it part of it kept me trapped a little bit, and that like you get some attention and then you feel the need to stay that way. But like I'm different, right? Like I'm growing. I have different ideas about things, and so it's just you know being able to move to where I want to be, and hopefully maintain an audience. But I'm just in a little blockage right now, that's all.
It sounds like maybe a cocoon period where you
Yeah,
step back into a cocoon and then later on you turn into that butterfly or and
yeah,
whatever
yeah,
else that
yeah.
looks like really.
Yeah, yeah, it's just, I think it's just part of life, is like nothing stays the same. So you just have to kind of, for me, it's like keep giving myself the freedom to adapt, and not getting too bogged down and like feeling pressure to create when I'm not feeling creative.
Yeah, I mean, that makes perfect sense to me. And I think, yeah, the more connected you are to yourself, I think the better it will go, right? So
Yeah,
meditation really helps with that.
yeah,
And I think as long as we're connected and we're being genuine and authentic, I think the right things will happen.
yeah, yeah, exactly,
At
exactly. I
least
mean,
that's how I
it's
try to see it.
to me, it's like all our relationships to other things, people, they're actually about our relationship to ourselves, right? And so, for me, it is about coming back home a little bit to myself, right? To kind of like, I don't feel like I'm seeing myself totally clearly right now, and so I have to get that back in line a little bit.
No, that makes perfect sense. But Christian, thank you so much for coming on the show. I always have a blast talking to you.
Thanks, Jared. I love it. Yeah, this was really fun.
All right, my man. You have a good one, sir.
Okay, we'll see you.